So that was the First Crusade. It's the paradigmatic crusade. I think we can say that it was a just war in the sense that it was a just expedition. The causes were just. It was reasonable to go to the aid of the Byzantine emperor. It was reasonable to liberate the territories which had been captured by the Muslims. It's not like the Welsh massacring the English in the 21st century on the grounds that they used to live in England 1,500 years ago. Although it was several centuries since those territories had been captured by the Muslims, nevertheless, the Christians were still either half or the majority of the population in many of those areas. And in some of them, they'd only just been captured by Islam a few decades earlier or a few years earlier, triggering the appeal by Alexius Comnenus in the first place. Now, of course, in the course of that war, there were many episodes, as happens in all wars, which are not morally acceptable. Of course, the attacks on the Jewish communities in Western Europe were appalling. Some of the behaviour of the Crusaders on the way to Constantinople, some of their actions in the course of the battle and the capturing of cities in the course of the First Crusade were not acceptable. Whenever judging the justice of a war, there are a number of different factors, but one of them is the likely collateral damage, whether the expedition is proportionate, the damage likely to be caused by the military action, is it out of all proportion to the to the evil that is to be remedied? In this case, I would say I don't think it is. As Catholics, one doesn't need to hold that. One could think that it is out of proportion. So long as one holds that an expedition of this nature in principle could be legitimate, that's really all that is demanded by the visibility of the Church and the involvement of the papacy and the councils in crusades over many centuries. We don't have to agree with the prudential judgments of popes and councils, so we might think that all actual concrete crusades were not proportionate responses to the threat in question, so long as we think that the idea in itself, had there been a way of doing it proportionately, is legitimate. But as I say, I think as it happens, the First Crusade was proportionate, however unfortunate and reprehensible may be some of the abuses that occurred along the way. The Crusading movement lasted in its pomp for about 200 years. The last Christian possessions on the mainland of the Holy Land were eliminated by Islamic reconquest in the 1290s. Jerusalem itself was lost slightly less than 100 years later, in the 1180s, after the Battle of Hattin, on the 4th of July, 1186. And when the King of Jerusalem and his armies were isolated without water and defeated in a terrible defeat, and then subsequently Jerusalem itself was reconquered by the famous Kurdish Islamic leader Saladin. The reason why this attempted reconquest of the Holy Land was not successful in the long term is the flip side of the reason why the First Crusade was a success. After a while, it wasn't unexpected anymore. The military techniques of the Crusaders were no longer weird and unknown to the local rulers. The Muslims were prepared. Increasingly, they were united. They'd been very divided at the point at which the First Crusade occurred. So once the exceptional conditions which led to the success of the First Crusade began to disappear, the likelihood of success in fighting Islam in this region began to diminish. In the course of the Third Crusade, the great English king and crusader Richard the Lionheart, he realised that one of the essential problems of the crusading movement was that it needed a sort of substitute Byzantine empire. Pope Urban II had intended that the Byzantine emperor would lead the First Crusade, and that at its climax, the Holy Land and the surrounding territories would be reintegrated into the Byzantine Empire, no doubt with, positions for such Westerners as wanted to remain. That failed because Alexius turned back before reaching Antioch, and that meant that these territories ended up being isolated, quasi-colonial settlements without a sufficient geopolitical and strategic hinterland to sustain them against the inevitable Islamic attempts at reconquest. So Richard the Lionheart thought, well, perhaps if the Byzantines can't be persuaded to do what they're supposed to do, which they apparently couldn't, because although the Emperor Manuel I Komnenos did try to rise to this position, in the end he didn't win in the key engagements which he undertook, and his deeply unpleasant cousin Andronicus I Komnenos ended up initiating a massacre against Latins in the east across his entire empire, which permanently alienated the Latins from the Byzantines, caused them to never trust them again. The Byzantines were already not inclined to trust the Latins because they were uncouth and far more violent than the Byzantines. This was confirmed when the Fourth Crusade was diverted to sacking Constantinople itself, which meant that the hatred between the Latins and the Greeks was entrenched for the foreseeable future. So, as an alternative to relying on Byzantine support, Richard the Lionheart thought a concerted effort to conquer Egypt, which is the most prosperous and well endowed with natural resources of all territories in that region, if that were to succeed and Egypt were to become a Christian territory once again, of course Egypt again has lots of Christians in it. The original Egyptian population, the Copts, were a very, very large minority in that territory, still speaking their ancient language. So there's an obvious basis for a renewed Christian Egypt, and then Egypt would provide the backup for the Christian control of the Holy Land. So many crusades were sent to try and achieve this, but unfortunately none of them succeeded. So by the end of the 13th century, people were beginning to despair of the chances of the crusading movement ever really succeeding. And so from the 1290s onwards, no significant successful expedition directly against the Holy Land was engaged ever again. And Jerusalem would not fall into Christian hands until it was conquered by Britain at the end of World War I, by which time the prospect of it turning back into Christian territory was long gone sociologically. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, there were the instrument of crusade was used against the heretics of southern France, the Cathars, who were seen as violently attempting to overthrow Christian society, and so a crusade was unleashed against them, somewhat hesitantly, by Pope Innocent III, which ended up being quite famously bloody. There was also a crusade, the Northern Crusade, launched against the pagan Balts of the Baltic, the ancestors of the Lithuanians, and their cousins anyway, and this was quite successful. It was led by one of the military religious orders which emerged in the course of the Crusades. So these were warrior monks. They weren't ordained to the priesthood, but they were in vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And like a lay knight, they would spend their entire life training in military training. But it was devoted to the crusade instead of to controlling as many patches of territory as possible in Western Europe. So the two main of these religious orders were the Hospitallers and the Templars, who operated in the Middle East. But there was another one which originally operated in the Middle East. Well, there were several others, but one of them that originally operated in the Middle East, but was less prominent and successful, was the Order of the Hospital of St. Mary of the Teutons, known as the Teutonic Knights, and they were invited by the Holy Roman Emperor to defend the eastern flank of the Holy Roman Empire from the pagan Balts, and they were allowed to rule over the territories which they conquered. So they created for themselves a little ecclesiastical theocratic statelet on the shore of the Baltic. Yes, their conduct was not always above reproach, to say the least. But again, as I said, no Catholic is obliged to defend these institutions across the board, merely their theoretical permissibility, were they to behave themselves and were they to be a proportionate response. So that's essentially the crusading movement. Crusading indulgences were given at other times when it looked like Europe was going to be overrun by Islamic conquest, in order to try and prevent the fall of the Byzantine Empire, which eventually didn't succeed. The Byzantine Empire fell to Islam in 1453, and the fall of Vienna nearly occurred on a number of occasions, and some crusading indulgences were issued to prevent that, and also around the great naval battle of Lepanto in the 16th century, in which the Ottoman Turks were prevented from gaining general naval control of the whole Mediterranean by the combined Spanish and Papal fleets. So it seems clear that in most of these cases, the granting of an indulgence was a legitimate response to a just war, which genuinely needed to be won in order to prevent the conquest of Christendom. I believe Pius XII even suggested on one occasion that he toyed with the idea of granting indulgence for anyone fighting a war against communism, but he never did do that in the end. Of course, one of the problems is that modern states are usually, not always, but usually not formally Christian. So it makes the idea of sort of blessing them with an indulgence for their armed forces a little bit more complicated and questionable. In conclusion, there's a story recorded by Brother Illuminato, one of the early companions of St. Francis of Assisi, about his conversation with the Sultan of Egypt, who he visited in the course of the Fifth Crusade. The Sultan said to St. Francis, what are you doing here? Because Francis had come in the company of these crusaders. Said, what are you doing here? Surely, your religion's all about turning the other cheek and peace and love and all that sort of thing. And you've come here in the baggage of a Western army. What hypocrisy! And St. Francis said, it's true that we are told by our Saviour that we should love you as the apple of our eye, even though you are our enemy. But everywhere you go and everywhere you conquer, you humiliate and degrade and enslave and kill and reduce to humiliating inferior social condition the Christian populations which you overrun, and many of them are led into apostasy and abandoning the gospel in favour of the deliverances of your false prophet. I don't think he put it quite that bluntly. And therefore we must be mindful of our Lord's other injunction that if thine eye scandalise thee, pluck it out. And therefore, loving you though we do as the apple of our eye, we are forced to violently remove you in order to prevent the destruction of Christian society and the loss of many little ones. And that, very succinctly expressed by the Seraphic Father, is the essential basis and justification for the Crusades. And for all their many and serious imperfections, it is ultimately a legitimate argument and a sound justification.